for a quick show of hands about how many people were outraged when they read about what the intelligence community was doing with the that we found out about with the Snowden leaks. I can't see anybody because I am being blinded by light, but I am seeing movement, and I feel like a Tyrannosaurus Rex now. So lots of outrage. All right, who feels like after 5 years of hard work and millions of dollars put into the privacy community and all of the times you've called your members of Congress and sent emails to them and taken to the streets that we've solved it, right? Like, we're good, right? No, nothing? All right. So in June of 2015, which is 2 years after the first of the Snowden leaks were published, former NSA Director Michael Hayden described his reaction to changes made to the telephone metadata dragnet program by the recently passed USA Freedom Act. Michael Hayden said, and I'm quoting here, "And this is it after 2 years? Cool." There were a lot of dramatic changes after the Snowden leaks 5 years ago, which I think I don't need to reiterate to this crowd about end-to-end encryption, changes in behavior, changes in perceptions about mass surveillance, and so on and so forth. But what did not result from the Snowden leaks was any meaningful limitations on the scope or extent of mass surveillance by the intelligence communities in the United States. Exacerbating this, there has not been a public, let alone a private debate as to why congressional reform achieved since Snowden, which the short version are the USA Freedom Act, which revised and reauthorized parts of the Patriot Act, including the phone metadata dragnet, and the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act of 2017, which, to give you an idea of the dysfunction that we're facing, that was passed in 2018, despite having 2017 in the name. Which reauthorized the FISA Amendments Act covering the now renamed PRISM surveillance program and other programs. These have not meaningfully decreased either the amount of surveillance that has taken place or the uses that it's been put to. Before I begin this panel, I want to caveat everything that I'm going to be saying and that the panelists here are going to be saying by talking about the title of the panel, which is the phrase, "What went wrong with surveillance reform since Snowden?" This is a provocative title, admittedly. There have been changes, and we'll talk about some of them, although with the time limitations, we won't get to all of them. However, if your goals, which I think all of my panelists here and myself and everybody in this room shares, are to, one, limit the amount of surveillance conducted or its use, or two, to position ourselves so that in the near future we can limit the amount of surveillance or its uses, we've not succeeded, despite immense amounts of public pressure, despite millions of dollars invested into the privacy community in order to reform surveillance at the national level. So our goal to start this conversation about what needs to change to curtail mass surveillance at a pace that matches the frightening rise of authoritarian ideologies, which will foreclose on the possibility of a free society if given the opportunity and the tools and the infrastructure with which to do so. With me to jumpstart that debate today are Alex Matthews of Restore the Fourth, which is a 501c4 nonprofit dedicated to ending unconstitutional mass surveillance. Marcy Wheeler, an independent national security and civil liberties reporter whose writings can be found regularly at emptywheel.net. And all the way at the end, we've got Sean Vitka, who lobbies Congress on surveillance and internet freedom issues for Demand Progress. Moderating the panel is myself, Jeff Landale. I'm an independent internet freedom organizer and researcher. I've worked with Access Now, the New America Foundation, XLab, and Demand Progress. We don't have a ton of time, so we're going to try to cover a 5-year period in 45 minutes now, maybe less, to get some questions in. So the prerequisite to legislative reforms to surveillance is to understand what surveillance is actually occurring and under what authorities and regulations in order to be able to change those authorities and regulations and put a stop to the unconstitutional mass surveillance that we've been aware of for 5 years, or if you were reading about Mark Klein, more than 5 years, or if you remember COINTELPRO for many, many decades. So my first question is to Marcy. Marcy, what are some of the failures that you've seen in the policy community to understand what surveillance is actually happening, what's being overlooked, and why aren't we finding these issues?
I recently had a conversation with Bob Litt. For those who don't know, he's the general counsel, the former general counsel of ODNI, who advised James Clapper back in 2013 it was a good idea to answer Ron Wyden's question about whether the government was collecting on millions of Americans, not wittingly. So I went to Bob recently and I said, Bob, I think you had a strategy of burying the privacy community in transparency. And by that I mean, in addition to the Snowden documents, which few people in the DC policy community have read, the government released a ton of documents, some of which are enormously helpful to explain what was actually going on with the phone dragnet and with 702, what you may know as PRISM, and nobody read it. And so I said to Bob, did you bury them on purpose? And he's like, well, it's like any analytical thing. Sometimes it's really hard to find the diamond in the rough. And he kind of chortled because he's like that. Instead of reading those documents, what the ODNI did at the same time was kind of embrace the privacy community and invite them to the table. And so rather than reading the documents that were a response to Snowden, and therefore were part of what Snowden basically risked his life to give us, the privacy community in DC enthusiastically sat down at a table with Alex Joel, who's part of ODNI, supposedly the privacy officer, and let him tell them what was going on rather than reading the documents.
Thank you, Marcy. A follow-up for you, I think, is this an issue of the quality of the analysts, or are there structural issues where entire institutions and organizations which have offices dedicated to this are not able to sift through the amount of information and transparency that they're getting in order to come to a solid understanding of what's going on?
I think there's a theory among the privacy community in DC, many of whom are lawyers, that if 7 JDs sit down in a room and read the statute, they will understand what's going on. What actually needs to happen, at least in my experience, is people who don't need JDs, I don't have a JD, I do have a PhD, but I don't have a JD, need to sit down and read the minimization procedures, which are basically where FISC tells the government what they're allowed to do.
It's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court?
Yeah, something like that. And that never happened. So there are lawyers in New York. I mean, there are the only other people who I know of who've read all of the documents that were released by ODNI are some ACLU lawyers, litigators here in New York. I know of no other people in the country with the possible exception, well, with the exception of Laura Donahue, who's now a FISC amicus. I know of no other people in the country who've read these documents. Instead, some lawyers sit down and read the law, and as a result, don't understand what's really going on behind the law.
Thank you, Marcy. My next question is to Sean. We're getting legislative proposals that overlook the actual functioning of surveillance infrastructure, both legally and technologically, and which aren't going far enough to inspire that many people to get involved to get a bill passed. What's going on in Congress where we're getting shit bills?
It's a great question. So I'm going to tell a story, I think, about the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act, if that makes sense, Jeff.
Yep.
We just lost in a major way earlier this year. The FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act of 2017 became law. There is a very complicated process that goes into it, and it really predates the 702 fight. Again, this is what authorizes PRISM and upstream. It's born from the USA Freedom debate, which if you're not familiar with, I would recommend checking out Marcy's readings. But to abbreviate this, let's start at the end of it. We, in the privacy community, often considered the USA Freedom debate to be kind of the precursor to 702, because as bad as the bulk metadata dragnet was, the use of PRISM and upstream was for me at least, much more disturbing. So we worked really hard on this. And we started out very early trying to meet with the intelligence community, meet with the administration, meet with every member of Congress we possibly could. At the end of the day, the people on the Hill decided that in the interest of making sure that a bill that they were working on, theoretically to reform it, would get a vote in committee, which is a necessary step, more or less, that they would have to work with Bob Goodlatte. So Chairman Goodlatte is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and under no circumstances would he be considered an ally of reform. So at the outset, we had a very difficult question, and I think we answered it wrong. We had somebody like Bob Goodlatte in the room deciding what reform was going to go to the floor. Now, from the perspective of what can we actually get and have a debate over in committee, there's some sense to that. He's the chairman. If he's on board, he can push it. The problem is that it robs the grassroots, it robs the activists of the opportunity to actually hold members accountable. Because suddenly the only reform bill that had been seriously worked on and vetted ends up being the USA Liberty Act, which, I'm going to use parlance here, doesn't successfully, at introduction, close the backdoor search loophole, which was the foundational, the archstone of reform for us for a long time. And there was a scramble, and we were stuck with an unfortunate choice. Do we abandon ship? Do we leave the only bill that seems to have path forward? And if so, what do we do? Some of us did, and Demand Progress, I'm happy to say, absolutely said that it was an unacceptable bill. We end up eventually getting something called the USA Rights Act, not introduced in committee, but introduced by Senators Wyden and Paul, and also in the House. USA Rights Act was kind of a gold standard reform bill, but everybody told us we could never get a vote on it. Eventually, you end up with USA Liberty getting steamrolled by leadership. Instead, the intelligence community writes a bill with the House Intelligence Committee, our good friend Devin Nunes, and they just completely steamroll the Judiciary Committee, and their bill goes to the floor instead. So USA Liberty never gets a vote. It dies an extremely quiet death after passing out of Judiciary. So a lot of good it did us, organizing and spending all that time working on this bill in tandem with one of our greatest opponents, which is Chairman Goodlatte. So that ends up becoming law. And that the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act ends up expanding the use, for instance, of 702 in court against defendants who aren't, accused of terrorism or something else. You can now use it for international narcotics. It's a pretty dramatic problem. But we did have this one glimmer of hope. Right before that vote, some of our allies on the Hill managed to get a promise for a vote on the USA Rights Act. And so suddenly this bill that was the gold standard and that that everybody was telling us we couldn't possibly get, a vote for, gets 183 votes as a replacement to the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act. You need 218. 183 isn't super close, but that's a winnable fight. But we had done an inadequate job of laying the groundwork to get that bill passed. And so we went from a situation where we almost had every reform we wanted to an actual degradation of the status quo.
Thank you, Sean. And when you say that everyone was saying that the USA Rights Act, which came reasonably close to passing, couldn't pass, that's including members of the privacy reform community, correct?
Yeah, we had a letter to support the USA Rights Act, and some organizations actually, well, one in particular explicitly said that they wouldn't sign on because they just didn't think it was worth the time.
Thank you, Alex. Excuse me. Thank you, Sean. My next question is to Alex. Alex, you spend a lot of time organizing at the grassroots level. You are not based in DC, so you're not beholden to some of the same stringent requirements that those of us there sometimes face. What are your thoughts on why the grassroots isn't showing up in the same way that perhaps it has for the SOPA-PIPA fight or for net neutrality? Why aren't we seeing, if not people taking to the streets necessarily, but the same level of constituent mobilization and phone calls and emails being driven in support of the bills that are being put forward in Congress?
I think, to me, it seems a relatively simple analysis. I know why I am involved in grassroots organizing, and I know a lot of people who are involved in surveillance organizing, and I have some notion of why they're involved. And as you said at the top of the panel, what motivates us is trying to decrease surveillance. Having more transparency is nice. It can be an instrument towards that goal. But what motivates us is measures that will decrease surveillance, and that is why we put in the hours that we do. And it seems absurd to pursue a strategy that is so much focused on what individual gatekeepers in DC will accept, that you're implicitly premising it on being able to mobilize your own members and being able to mobilize people to call in, but people won't call in if they don't care. And they won't care if what they're offered is something that is at best a maintenance of the status quo with additional transparency, and at worst an actual worsening of the status quo. There's a lot of obfuscation in this area, there's a lot of complexity, and grassroots activists in the main are wanting to have a cause to fight for, and that poses a difficulty. I think that part of what we also see is that there was an overvaluing of the power of this particular gatekeeper, and an assumption that Bob Goodlatte would be able to get not only a bill discussed in committee, but would be able to have enough influence over leadership to have it receive a vote on the floor that would be a reasonable vote, and that it would have a chance of passage. And I think nobody among the people who were focusing on Congress was really thinking about how that would be the case. And how that would be the case is through grassroots pressure. It takes thousands of calls, it takes tens of thousands, and there needs to be a tapping into that energy and a respecting of that energy.
Thank you, Alex. I think this next question is to all three panelists, and you can answer it perhaps rapid fire if you want to go into more detail as well. But how do you respond to the argument that if we can't even get this incremental change, if we can't get the USA Liberty Act, which dies in committee and never gets a floor vote, how are we supposed to be able to get even bigger and bolder and more comprehensive changes?
I'll have to take a first crack. So on top of surveillance, I also handle net neutrality. And it is night and day looking at the two. One is a robust, popular movement. And it allows us on the Hill to choose our allies, choose who's going to lead the fight, to make demands, and to force people to go on record. If you have a bill that shows up in the middle, you never really get to ask the question, are you pro-warrantless surveillance under Donald Trump or not? That's the question we needed to be asking. I'll highlight actually the worst moment, in my opinion, of the FISA Amendments reauthorization fight, which was during the House floor debate when USA Rights was being voted on. And Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, with the strong backing of Ranking Member Adam Schiff, they took the floor and urged their members to vote against USA Rights. In other words, to preserve warrantless surveillance under Donald Trump. Again, we ended up with 183 votes, but we had Representative Pelosi and Representative Schiff pretty much at the end dominate for the last 10 minutes of debate time, urging Democrats and everybody to not pass USA Rights. So if we end up in that situation, and we've had a middling debate, or a debate about a middling bill like the USA Liberty Act, we can't go, we don't have the groundwork laid. We can't take that razor to the fight and say, which side of this are you on? And instead we find out at the last second that somebody who should be whipping very aggressively in our favor is actually going to shoot us in the foot.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on this. Part of the problem about not laying out what is actually being done is that I last year in October covered what I now call the Tor exception. It's a secret application of Section 702 that accesses location obscured servers and is allowed to do that even if U.S. persons are using the servers like Tor, so long as the NSA gets rid of the U.S. person content after the fact. But there are 8, as Sean said, there are 8 enumerated crimes. Some of them are, bad, like like murder and kidnapping, and some of the and child porn, and some of them are crimes that are traditionally broadly expanded, meaning trafficking, which is often sex work, and CFAA, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is often activism. And so the government can now keep stuff from the dark web, and the bill actually codified it such that in addition to these eight crimes, anything that the Attorney General, meaning Jeff Sessions, deems a national security issue, so something like, say, BLM, Black Lives Matter, they can also keep that under the law as passed last year. Now, I covered that, and it was a very difficult story to write. I covered that. The privacy community pretty much blew it off. And so instead of saying Nancy Pelosi is about to vote, is about to whip to give Jeff Sessions the authority to decide to spy on Black Lives Matter in the name of foreign surveillance, instead of holding Nancy Pelosi accountable for whipping for that bill, we instead were kind of wishy-washy talking about going after terrorists. And that's the importance of being really honest about what these surveillance programs do, because Nancy Pelosi was able to pretend that what she did wasn't giving Jeff Sessions unreviewable authority to use these surveillance tools against Americans.
And the bill literally says there's no judicial review of the Attorney General's decision, by the way.
Marcy, you've had some other experiences as well with the privacy community, perhaps sidelining or actively pushing you out of the conversation when you raise criticisms of the bills that they are rallying around?
Yes. Well, I mean, look, you know, I can be a jerk, I admit it, and I can be strident about what I believe these things to do, but I now, you know, I guessed in 2009 about the phone dragnet 4 years before Edward Snowden, and started a leak investigation because people thought that there was no way I could just guess it. I have a very good track record on this, but you know, I don't have a JD, so I think people in DC don't like girls from Michigan stridently saying you need to listen to what the surveillance is actually doing, because it ruffles feathers, I guess.
Some of us do, just not enough.
I think that's the polite answer from Marcy this time around.
Get me drunk later and I'll...
So Alex, do you have any thoughts about why being able to achieve bolder and more comprehensive reform may be a potential route? I'm definitely leading you on with this question towards success rather than middling and incremental reform.